Okay, got that going. Ignore all the writing to the sides. That's for class I have after this for physics. Yeah. But so today we're going over Aristotle's Ethics. In particularly, the only work I focused on was his Nicomachean Ethics. He has another famous work on ethics, and they're somewhat repetitive. This is considered his more complete work, Nicomachean Ethics. Now, before we jump directly into his ethics, he's going to make a little bit of reference to some of his psychology that we've already talked about. So I wanted to briefly touch upon a point in his psychology that he's going to reference a few times in his ethics before we jump into his ethics. So a reminder about a point with his psychology. First crucial point is how he uses the word soul, right? The soul is like the form of the body. Yeah. It's not a spirit. It's the body together with that mind that makes it able to act and function. It's a living thing. When you're dead, there's no more soul. You're dead. So that's how he uses the word soul. And now we talk about three parts of your soul in our classification of humans. Now, first off, he has plants, animals, and then humans, and he classifies them based off of the functionality of their soul. For plants, they have a vegetative soul. All they're capable of is reproduction and growth. The nutritional element of them, they just grow. And then you get to animals, and they have a sensitive soul. In his ethics, we're going to refer to this as the appetitive soul. So you have the vegetative part of you, you have the appetitive part of you. Animals, they can sense pleasures and pains, and as a general rule, they want to seek pleasure and avoid pains. That's an animal thing. Plants don't really do that. Animals are the ones that suffer pleasure and pain. And then finally, you have the rational soul as a part of you. And so we're going to roughly classify three elements of your soul in the Nicomachean Ethics again, following this structure that we talked about already in the psychology. And we're going to use the word soul a lot, which is one that was defined in his psychology. Make sense? Any questions there? Good. Okay, so jumping up to now ethics. Jumping to Aristotle's Ethics. And really quick, we'll start out with just the opening line of his ethics. Every art and every type of inquiry, and likewise every act and purpose, seems to aim at some good. And so it has been well said that good is that at which everything aims. So remember now, we're in ethics, so we're interested in the good. What is the good? It's that at which everything aims. Everything seems to aim at some good. Every action you perform, you're ultimately trying to achieve some good from that action, right? Now, first thing we're going to do here is be a little bit critical of Plato's use of the word good. Remember, Plato's version of good, it's like the form of good, that ultimate thing, that one thing that if you could just comprehend and know, you suddenly know everything. And so he thought there was one form of the good which accounts for all goods. And anytime you see good in the universe, according to Plato, it's like an instance of that form of the good. So Plato thought there was this one form, this one, the good, and that's what everyone's always making reference to when they're talking about goods. That's the first thing Aristotle is going to take issue with, this idea of there being that one good. So the first thing he points off is, since there are many arts and sciences, then there are many ends. The end of medicine is health, the end of war is victory, etc. Where one art, oh sorry, I jumped the gun with Plato's point. That's not the first thing he's going to say here. Sorry about that. So, where one art is subordinate to another, if we were to think about some chain of arts that are performed, think about bridle making. Hey. What? All right. That's fine. Hurry along. We'll just keep going. Okay. So when you think about bridle making, you know what bridles are for a horse, right? Bridle making, what's the point of bridle making is to create bridles. And you might think that that's something that you need if you're going to exercise something like horsemanship. Horsemanship, you're going to need someone to make the bridle so that you can practice horsemanship. And you might think that horsemanship is a useful art for something like soldiering, for training cavalry. If you have a cavalry unit, one of the things he needs to know how to do is not only have horsemanship, but he needs to be able to fight on horseback and organize with his fellow cavalry on maneuvering and stuff like that. And soldiering is something that you need to know if you want to win a war, for example. So he says, notice that here you might be considering war. War needs to use soldiering. Soldiering needs to use horsemanship. Horsemanship needs to use bridle making. Right? And if you're out to win a war, well, yeah, if you're out to win a war, what's the end of war? Victory. If you're fighting a war, you care a lot more about the ends of war. You care a lot more about victory or defeat than you do about if your soldiers were completely trained, than you do about if your cavalry did good on their horses, than you do about if the bridles were well made. So the end of this is less important than the end of this is less important than the end of this is less important than the end of this. This is the ultimate end. It's what's most important. This is subordinate, this is subordinate, this is subordinate. And the ends of this art are just a means to this art. The end of bridle making is a good bridle, which is just a means to horsemanship. And horsemanship is just a means to being a good soldier. And being a good soldier is just a means to war and winning a war. So we have this stack of means and ends, means and ends, means and ends. The end here is a means here, the end here is a means here, etc. So where one art is subordinate to another, the end of the master art is always more desirable than the ends of the subordinate arts, since these are pursued for its sake. So the end of this art is superior to this, the end of this art superior to this, the end of this art superior to this. Make sense what he's saying there? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're setting up this chain of ends, means and ends, and we're going to ultimately be looking for some ultimate end. So then the ultimate end, that which we desire for its own sake and not as a means to some other end, will be the good, or at least the best of all things. Right? Yeah. The end of this is superior to the end of this, is superior to the end of this, is superior to the end of this. Imagine that we made one of these chains for all human action. Then the end that we finally desire right at the end must be the most good thing. It's the most desirable thing. The ultimate end. That's what we mean by the ultimate end. Does that make sense? So, we set up all those arts. What is the most master art? What is the art that is master of all other arts? And Aristotle says it's politics. Politics is a master of all other arts. Now remember that we're talking about relative to human action, not relative to human study. Okay. Don't get those mixed up. Talking about relative to human action. We switched, should have probably drawn this little diagram really quick before that we had at the very beginning. So if we go way, way back to the very beginning, we had the theoretical philosophy. We had practical philosophy. And then we had, what do we call it? Productive or something like that. Philosophy. And then theoretical philosophy, we were interested in metaphysics, mathematics, and then physics, and the sub-branches of physics. Natural philosophy. Practical philosophy, now this is our first branch of practical philosophy. Practical philosophy, we're interested in politics and ethics. Okay. And then the productive philosophies, this is the arts, actual constructing things. That's right. So looking at the arts and looking at practical philosophy, the most master of those is going to be politics, is what he's saying. Politics is what rules over all of that. All human action is governed ultimately by politics. It's the most master art. The ends of politics are the most master ends. Okay, right? Because it's ultimately, when you think about something like war, who's war for? It's for your city. You want victory in war for the sake of your city or your political unit. They're used to city-states here, so that's why it's called politics. The polis is the Greek word for city. So that's where it comes from. Anyways, so what is most master art? Politics. It rules over war, economics, rhetoric, etc. It is politics that makes use of all the practical sciences and determines what sciences a state ought to pursue and to what extent. Right? So that's why it's the most master art. Thus, the end of politics includes the ends of every other practical science. Every practical science and every art functioning at some good is ultimately operating towards the ends of whatever politics is targeted at. Ultimately, all your human action is trying to create a better state. Yeah. Or ultimately it does. So, thus the end, politics, politics. While a single man achieving this good is desirable, while it's great for a single person to achieve whatever this ultimate end is, the good, while that's desirable, it's grander for an entire state to achieve this good. So you might think, no, the ultimate end is my personal good. Aristotle says, yeah, that's a great end, but wouldn't you say that everyone's, including your personal good, is a superior end to just your personal good? Yeah. And so if that's a finer thing, then that makes politics superior to ethics. So ethics, in particularly, is focused on the morality of the individual, how to make a good individual, and then politics is more focused on the morality of the state. And for Aristotle, you get a bunch of good individuals, that happens to produce a good state. Okay.
So this is different from Plato's idea on politics?
Yes. So Aristotle and Plato have very differing ideas on politics. Plato says we need to look towards the good of the state, and the individual ought to sacrifice for the sake of the state. And so if we got to sacrifice your happiness to make us three happier, so be it. Aristotle says the way that you maximize the happiness of a state is you maximize the happiness of every individual. And there's no reason that you should have to compromise your happiness for me. Yeah. So that's one of the fundamental differences between them. So Aristotle is very individualistic. Yeah. He says, and that happens to produce the best state. So he also is a strong advocate of like private property, where Plato wanted communism. Everyone shares everything. For the same thing, for the good of the state. Okay, so since in ethics, we can only work with probable premises, we can only come to probable conclusions. So this is important. We are not in a, he's recognizing we are not doing a geometry class here. We're not doing a physics class. We're not doing something where the premises are perfectly understood and then we're using perfect reasoning to come to perfect conclusions. Our premises, he recognizes, they're just probable premises. We're going to have to work with premises like wealth is usually a good, right? Most of the time if you give someone wealth, that helps them. Now maybe they're a drug addict, you give them $5,000, that's enough for them to go overdose, and now they killed themselves. Was that wealth good for them? No. There's going to be exceptions to the rules basically every single time we try to come up with some ethical premise is what he's saying. So we come to conclusions like wealth is usually good, and then so we can also only come to probable conclusions like men usually should pursue wealth. There may be cases where that's a bad idea, but for the most part, you're better off with more wealth, you're better off pursuing wealth. Make sense what you're saying there? And that's the best that we can do in this field of science. And he has a little statement justifying it. For it is the mark of an educated man to require, in each kind of inquiry, just so much exactness as the subject matter admits of. Right? Depending on what the subject matter is, that tells you how perfect a proof you should look for. Right? I can't scientifically prove the Pythagorean theorem. No one would accept that. If I went out there and I got 10 trillion triangles and I measured all of them as perfectly as I could and I said, see, look, it works, you'd say, so what? That doesn't count. In math, we require perfection. That's a physical proof. So all you show me is that's most likely true. So he says something to the effect of, to expect syllogistic proof from a rhetorician is as absurd as to expect it here. Okay, something to that effect. So while the premises of a theoretical science can be known by youth, so remember that, now we're talking about theoretical sciences, these are the ones that can be well understood. These are not probable ones. So while the premises of a theoretical science can be known by youth, the premises of a practical science are not exact, and so cannot be understood by youth. There is no objective set of rules for all practical situations. In other words, your personal experience has to come into understanding the premises that we talk about. I could tell you right now the postulates of geometry, and then we could start working with geometry, because you can perfectly understand those postulates, and there's no concern there. When we talk about in the practical sciences, and when we talk about the premises of the practical sciences, since they can't be perfectly stated, we have to rely on some extent, we have to rely on your personal experience to some extent to understand those premises. Since youth have very little of that experience, youth cannot understand completely, cannot understand the premises of a practical science. And so as a general rule, youth are worse at practical reasoning than elderly people, who are very well practiced in practical reasoning. Okay, so a man is a good judge of the things he knows, and a good judge without qualification when he receives a universal education. Makes sense so far, right? Hence, a young man is not qualified to be a student of politics, for he lacks experience of the affairs of life, which form the data and the subject matter of politics. Politics is related to the experiences of life. Youth doesn't have those experiences, and so youth ought not be studying politics. It's not appropriate for them. They need to go get some life experience first, then they're ready for politics. Okay. Make sense? Okay. In general, young people are more driven by emotions, while older people have likely learned to accord with reason in forming their desires. So since you, as a youth, are more driven by your emotions as a general rule, you're more likely to, since premises can't be perfectly stated, there's almost like wiggle room, and you need to use your experience to wiggle those premises correctly. But if you're an emotionally driven youth and you already have some moral conclusion that you want to come to, you'll twist those premises and your argument as much as you can to get to the conclusion you want, rather than trying to rationally think about what's the right conclusion. Right?
Yeah.
You tell your mom, hey, I want to go to this party. She says, no, I don't think that's a good idea. You say, why not? And you start arguing with her, trying to fudge with any little thing she'll give you as much as you can to come to the conclusion you should let me go to that party. Because you're just focused on the end. You're not trying to practically reason. You're driven by your emotions. And you're trying to come to the conclusion that you want to come to. It's a dangerous thing because we can't perfectly state these premises. Make sense? His warning to youth there. Okay, so that's his little preface to who are the proper students of the work he's now going to expound upon. So now, what is the ultimate end, that good, at which all things aims? That which all men desire for itself and for no other end. So what is the ultimate end? That which all men desire for itself and no other end. Now you can skip ahead and read happiness here, but think about this in your own personal life, or we'll just imagine some scenario. Imagine you walk into some McDonald's and you see a guy there flipping burgers. And you ask him, why are you flipping burgers? Well, it's my job, so I have to. Well, why do you have that as a job? Well, I'm trying to make some money. I'm trying to save up money. Well, what are you trying to save up money for? Well, I'm trying to buy a car. Well, why do you want to buy a car? And imagine you kept asking him why, all the way through. Eventually, he's going to come to this conclusion, or something synonymous with it, because it'll make me happier. And then if you ask someone the question, why do you want to be happy? That question should not receive an answer. You don't want to be happy because some other thing. There's a reason why you want to be happy. Happiness isn't a means to some other end.
Yes.
Happiness is the ultimate end. There's nothing that you want. You don't want to be happy so that you can something else. Does that make sense? Now we need to have a little bit of discussion about this word happiness as the way Aristotle's using it. Remember that these translations happened earlier in history and then they just kind of stick with how it was translated. So the Greek word that they're translating there is eudaimonia, and some other ways of translating it is a flourishing life or a full life, happiness. And they do not mean here what it's come to mean in modern times. They do not mean a psychological state. They do not mean a state of experiencing pleasure.
Yeah.
Right? So if you were to look at the guy who's been working hard his whole life, he's got a nice family, his house is paid off, living a comfortable life, and then you look at the other man out there who's drinking and partying, and you ask him which one's experiencing more pleasure right now, which one seems happier right now, you might say the guy out there drinking and partying. But then if he says who has a happier life, you're tempted to say that first person. Their life is more full, it's more flourishing. So when we're talking about happiness, we are not talking about a psychological state. We're talking about an ethical state. It is not a current feeling that you have, it's a state of character. Does that make sense, the difference between those? Okay. So, Greek said eudaimonia. It's been mostly translated as happiness, and now the fact that we stick with happiness is just a matter of historical consistency. Yeah. But how that word's used in more modern times has degraded to talk about psychological states, thanks to all those lovely psychologists who want to tell you about happiness because it became so prominent in so many words. And they ruined the word. Anyways, so while everyone agrees that happiness, or something to that effect, a full flourishing life, some people say, oh, it's not really happiness, and then give something synonymous with what Aristotle meant. That's all they do. So while everyone agrees that happiness is the ultimate end, they disagree about what produces happiness, or about how to define happiness exactly. Some say pleasure, or wealth, or fame, or health, etc. There's a lot of disagreement now about what actually produces happiness, right? And typical for Aristotle is he starts out by classifying what everybody thinks, and then tries to use that in his arguments for the right conclusion. Okay. So he's trying to get a sense of everyone's opinion on this subject matter. So some say it's all these pleasure, wealth, fame, health, whatever. And even sometimes the same person's opinion may change with circumstances. He may say health when he's ill, that's what makes you happy, is health when he's ill, but then he might say wealth when he's poor. So if we were to track the same man throughout his life, constantly asking him what produces happiness, he might even change his mind from moment to moment depending on the circumstances of his life. So people seem to be all over the place as to what produces happiness, right? Probably not too different today. So Aristotle does the best he can with these, trying to come up with some sort of classification, and after that, his rough classification, roughly speaking, his classification of the different types of life that people envy are, let's just say, roughly speaking, the types of lives desired by men can be split into three. The life of enjoyment, the life seeking out pleasures, experience as much pleasure as you can, that's a happy life. The life of the statesman, that's Aristotle's verbiage, but a better way to think about that modernly is a person out there seeking honors and fame, the honors and fame seeking life. Or finally, the contemplative life, a life spent contemplating things, where that's the focus of it. Each of those three make sense there?
Where would health fall into?
Huh?
Where would health fall into?
Where would health fall into? I would think that all three of those would say that you need some help to do that. Certainly you need to be healthy if you're going to experience pleasures, right? Sickness can stop you from living a contemplative life. How hard is it for you to do your algebra when you have the stomach flu?
So she's saying that
So he's saying these are the things that they're roughly looking for. And all those things seem to be captured in at least one of three of these types of categories of lives. So remember, we're cutting out a lot. So it's like he starts here and he ends up saying, so there's roughly these three types of lives. Okay. Any other questions on that? No. Okay. Now, obviously, the vulgar masses and even brutes say that the life of enjoyment is a happy life, right? So that's what most people think. Now, of those who say the statesman's life is to be preferred, he was able to split them into two different classes. The lesser of them say it for the sake of the honor. So some of them prefer the lives of the statesman just because they actually want that honor. And he says there's actually some people here with some pretty good intentions, in his estimation. The better of them use honor as a gauge of their own personal virtue. They assume that their receiving honors is a sign that they are accumulating virtues. In the latter case, then, they view happiness as a product of cultivating virtues rather than as a product of receiving honors.
Yeah.
Did that all make sense there? Okay. So those people tend to think virtue is what produces happiness, while some of them say, no, it's actually just the honors directly that produce happiness. So they're kind of split two ways, but they kind of seek the same kind of life. And then he deals with the person seeking the contemplative life much later in the book. So if you notice that that's not here, that's because he says, and we'll deal with this later. Okay. Now, some may be tempted to say, what about the life in pursuit of wealth? Notice that we didn't list that one. But, as money is just a means, it cannot be the ultimate end. Right? No one actually just wants money. If I stuck you on an island by yourself with $2 trillion and said bye-bye, what does that do you? Nothing. It's just a bunch of paper. I guess you can burn it. But pretty useless. So money in and of itself is pretty useless. It's just a means to an end. You want money for some other end. And so when we're talking about what the ultimate end is, what happiness is, it has to be an ultimate end. And money is obviously just a means, not an end. So money can't be an ultimate end. So whatever you wanted the wealth for, it was either to experience pleasures or to help you obtain honors, or maybe it was to help you get resources to live a more contemplative life. Whatever it was, money is just a means to an end. It's never the end in and of itself. You want the money for something else. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Next. Okay, now that we have covered what the many think about happiness, we'll start an analysis of what happiness is, keeping in mind that it is the greatest good of human life. It's what human life is targeted at. Right? Ultimately, what do you want? Happiness. Okay, now we're going to take issue with Plato. So Plato had his one universal good. If happiness is the ultimate end of human life, and it's the greatest good, then according to Plato, it would just be his form of the good. That's what happiness is. Aristotle doesn't like that, so now he's going to attack Plato.
Okay.
So first way, Aristotle takes issue with Plato's universal good. First thing he points out, if you go back to his 10 categories, you remember all the way back, first work of his we covered, the categories, and there were 10 categories, which are 10 classifications of things.
Yep.
The 10 initial classifications, and you never have cross classifications, right? If something's in one category, it's definitely not in the other. The categories don't overlap in any way. Remember that? Okay, so Aristotle takes issue with Plato's universal good. He points out that there is a good in each of the 10 categories, and he lists them all out, a good in each of the 10 types of categories. We'll get a couple of those in an example here. And yet, remember that in his thinking, substance is prior to the other 9 categories. So if we draw our square that we've drawn 100 times now, we had predicated of, in, not pred, not in, right?
Yep.
Remember that square? Now substances were either, oh, did I screw that up?
What do you want to switch it off?
Yeah, sorry. In, not pred. Let's just do not symbol, not pred. Okay. So, not predicated, not in. These are individual particulars. You, me, that tree, that lamp, that light bulb. Individual particular things. And then, predicated and not in. These are secondary substances. They're universals whose instances are substances. Right?
Yep.
So these together were his category substance. His category substance accounts for both of those. Primary substances and secondary substances. Right? Everything else has to be in. Both these, notice that both these are in. They have to be in a primary substance in order for them to exist. Right? So the other 9 categories are dependent upon this category for their existence. So this category, substance, is prior to all other 9 categories. Right? That makes sense? Okay, so if there's a good in substance, and it's the same good in all the other 9 categories, then this can't be prior to this, because they're both dependent on good. that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's his first issue that he's taken with here. Good in each of the 10 categories, yet substance is prior. Oh, yet substance is prior. Making good prior to good. Making it prior to itself, which doesn't make sense. Okay. And then he points out how it can be used in all the different categories and the various ways that we use this word good. Consider applying good to God. God is good, right? Consider applying good to reason. You have good reasoning. Or a good opportunity. Or something tastes good. He's picking some random things out of some different categories to show you how good applies in all these different categories. And so, he's going to say, they can't all be making reference to the same good form. Good is being used different ways in all these different categories. It can't be the same good being made reference to here.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. Okay. Next argument. He gives a bunch of arguments. I just pick out a couple. It's his way. Next. If there were only one good, there would only be one science which aims at that good. Right?
That makes sense.
Every science ends at some aim. And you can, based on what it aims at, you can deduce a science. If it aims at health, then you're talking about medicine. And so, if there were only one good, then there would only be one science which aims at that good. Rather than several different sciences, which there are several different sciences. Right? Every science has its own individual field. We talked about this a lot with the difference between going from geometry to physics. If we introduce the axioms of physics to geometry, or if you could get from the axioms of geometry to the axioms of physics, we wouldn't call physics physics. We'd still call it just geometry. Those are just new theorems. But no, it's a separate field of study. So in a similar way, they're separate fields of studies. So they can't be aimed at the same good. And then he takes several more issues with the notion of a universal good. Furthermore, typical of Aristotle's style, he gives a bunch of reasons why he thinks Plato's wrong, and then he says, even if Plato's right, and that's what he's going to do here. Further, even if Aristotle's wrong and Plato's right, and there is a one universal good, the good that we are interested in ethics is the good of human life, not the universal good. We're interested in something achievable by man. And so even if there is that crazy, weird, nebulous one good, it's obviously something not achievable by man. And what we're interested in is something achievable by man. We're interested in the end of human action. Make sense?
Yeah.
So he says, Plato, you're wrong, and even if you're right, you're irrelevant when it comes to ethics. So in every art, there is an ultimate good sought in medicine itself. What is the good sought for relative to human life? Now, we're going to come at happiness again, but now we're coming at it a different way to help us get a definition for happiness. So if it feels repetitive, it is. That's because now he's trying to get a definition for happiness. So he looks at a classification of goods. Goods that are desirable as means, but not for their own sake. Something like money. No one wants money for the sake of money. They want it. They only want it. It's only desirable as a means. It's not desired as an end in and of itself. You don't want money just to have money. You want money as a means to something else. Another example might be medicine. You don't take medicine because you love taking medicine, especially if it's nasty medicine. You take medicine as a means to some other end. So, of some of the goods, there are ones that are only desired as means, but not for their own sake. Then we have goods that are desired as means, as well as for their own sake. That's something like virtue, or the different virtues. You want to be wise for the sake of being wise, but you also want to be wise because it will make you happier.
Yeah.
You want to be courageous for the sake of being courageous, but you also want to be courageous because you think it'll make you happier. And you'll live a more flourishing life if you're courageous. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Is there any like physical stuff or any of that falls in that category?
I mean, something like good tasting food. You could use it as a means to keep you alive, and at the same time, you also just wanted the good tasting food. And then finally, there are goods that are only desirable for their own sake. Never as a means to an end, but just for themselves. And happiness is obviously the example of that. Happiness is the one thing we want only for its own sake, not as a means to something else. Make sense, this classification there?
Is happiness the only one in that category?
Can you come up with another one in that category?
Not off the top of my head.
All right, well, think about it for a long time, see what you come up with. All right. So, the good we are interested in must be the most final of these goods and not a means to some other good. So once again, it must be happiness. He's coming at it from another way here.
Yeah.
Looking at the styles of goods, obviously the most final good, the most desirable good is the one that we only want for its own sake and not as a means to some other end. Because we always desire the end more than the means. Right? Okay. So, in this other roundabout way, we come back to happiness. So happiness then is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of action, human action being there. Now, self-sufficient, let's focus on that for a second. Happiness is self-sufficient. What does he mean by that? He doesn't mean that if you are a happy man, then you can be out on a rock in a desert and you're now perfectly happy, self-sufficient, you don't need anything else. He means that once you achieve a happy life, it's self-sufficient, meaning that there's nothing more to be added. So if you achieve a happy life, you'll already have things like a moderate amount of wealth, a good family, you'll have cultivated the virtues, you'll have obtained wisdom, and once you have all those things that lead to a happy life, a flourishing life, then you'll be self-sufficient. Assuming you still have all those things. It doesn't mean that we now rip you up out of your life and you're self-sufficient, go stick you somewhere else and you're still that same happy person. Make sense?
Okay.
So self-sufficient doesn't mean independent on your own, because one of the things he thinks is humans are political animals, you need to be a part of society to live a happy life. Okay, so happiness then is something final and self-sufficient, can't add to it in any way, and is the end of action. So once you have a happy person, you can't give them one more good and make them more happy. They've already achieved it. Kind of. Okay. Now, bringing his metaphysics into this, to help us get a foundation. Remember that everything is matter and form, and that by its very nature, everything seeks to fully actualize itself. An acorn seeks to become an oak. This thing seeks to be on the ground because it's got that earth in it. The earth desires to be on the ground, an acorn desires to be an oak. Everything seeks to actualize itself. Ethics is a study of how human beings actualize themselves. That's what we're studying here if you come at it from a metaphysical perspective. We are making you more perfect in human form, a more excellent human. And what makes a thing, what it's trying to actualize depends on what it actually is. And you actually are a human. So when we talk about how to fully actualize a human, we have to take into consideration human nature. And we have to start with the facts of human nature. The same way that we consider, if we were to create an ethics for an acorn, what should an acorn try to do? It should try to do and accumulate all those things that help it become an oak. That's the best thing an acorn can do. And that's how it fully actualizes itself, is it becomes an oak. And if we're going to prescribe for an acorn the ethics it should follow to become an oak, we need to take into account the nature of an acorn. And so it's going to need things like water, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, when we talk about humans, we need to take into account the facts of human nature as they come into this world. And taking into those account those facts, then we talk about how they can fully actualize themselves. In other words, to talk about how he splits away from Plato, it starts out by talking about your body as a negative thing. It's bad. It's negative. For Aristotle, talking about your body as a negative thing is kind of like talking about an acorn shell as a negative thing. No, it's a fact of what it has. And it limits, and it helps dictate what it can become. So your human body isn't some bad thing. It's not some good thing. It's just a fact. You've got it. Now, how do we fully actualize this thing that you are based on your human nature? So human nature is a starting point. It's not a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. It's just a fact. Can you make sense of the point I'm trying to make there?
Yeah.
Trying to say for the difference between him and Plato's, where Plato was, you're this perfect soul entrapped in this terrible body, and your soul just wants to escape and be free from this body. And so he created a dichotomy. Aristotle doesn't have that dichotomy. It's not your soul versus your body. It's your soul working with your body to fully actualize. Okay. So, since we are establishing an ethics for man, we must start with the facts of human nature. And if we're going to start with the facts of human nature, we need to talk about the function of man, as opposed to the function of other things. What distinguishingly makes you man? What's that special thing that you have that makes you man, as opposed to cat, as opposed to toaster? What's your special function?
You're alive and you can think.
You're alive, but lots of animals are alive. It's your ability to be rational. That's what separates you from everything else. You are a rational animal. That's Aristotle's definition for man. Man is a rational animal.
Okay.
Make sense? And so, whatever ethics we prescribe for you has to take into account that you're a rational animal. If we were to come up with some ethics for a toaster, we have to take into account that it toasts bread. That's its distinguishing functionality. That's how you know it's a toaster. How do you know it's a man? It's a rational animal. So we have to take into account this rational fact in constructing our ethics. If we don't take that into account, we're not constructing an ethics for man. If we only take into account that you're alive, then we're constructing an ethics for living things in general. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, since we're establishing an ethics for man, we must start with the facts of human nature, and those facts peculiar to humans, our rational soul. A good life produces fully actualized humans through the exercise of our rational soul, through actualizing that as much as we can, somehow. Use Aristotle's word. The good of man is the active exercise of his soul's faculties in conformity with excellence or virtue. Now, virtue and excellence, those are kind of synonymous with Greek terminology for what we mean by virtue.
Okay.
A virtue means you do it well. Vice means you do it poorly. So an excellence or virtue. So let's say again. The good of man is the active exercise of his soul's faculties in conformity with excellence or virtue. Exercising your soul's faculties in an excellent way. Or, if there be several human excellences or virtues, in conformity with the best and most perfect among them. Moreover, to be happy takes a complete lifetime, for one swallow does not make a spring. So, 2 points being made there. One, it's this rational soul that we got to be exercising, since that's what's peculiar to humans. And we have to be exercising it in an excellent or virtuous way. That's the good way of exercising it, as opposed to the bad way of exercising it. And then the second point that he makes here is that it takes a complete lifetime to be happy. And happiness isn't something like you go along, and now you achieve perfect happiness and you're done. And he gives a bunch of analogies and more explanation on this. I'll give you the analogy of a football game. Imagine you're watching a football game and your favorite team's playing. When can you say that that football game is a good football game? Right?
When it's over.
Only when it's over. If you're a little premature, then the game can still go south for you. It gets less and less probable that if your team keeps scoring, it becomes less and less probable that it's suddenly going to turn into a bad game and that your team's going to lose. But it's still potentially possible, right?
Yeah.
Up to some limiting factor. So he says, think about the happy man that same way. They're going to accumulate happiness, or get closer and closer and closer to being happy. But until they're dead, their lives could still go south in a hurry. And they could be completely ruined and die an absolutely miserable person. And when you look at their life as a whole, you would not say that was a happy person. So happiness, you have to consider the life as a whole.
But can't you be like happy right now?
Well, then he says, what do we mean when we congratulate someone, in their terminology, being happy, so not the psychological usage of the word. He says, typically what we mean when we're calling someone happy is we're saying that they're on their way to living a happy life. The same way that when you say this is a good football game, you mean that it's on its way to becoming a good football game. It's not a good football game yet we use that language all the time. This is a good game. It's been a good game thus far, and it looks like it's going to be a good game. they have lived a happy life thus far, and it looks like they're going to live a fully happy life.
I see.
But if the end's terrible, would you call the whole life a happy life? Okay, so there's that. So next, Aristotle considers the wisdom of the past, keeping in mind that with a true view, all the data harmonize, but with a false one, the facts soon clash. So he's already done an analysis now of what the many of his contemporaries think, and he's done a quick analysis into what happiness is. Now he's going to look at what people in the past have said about happiness, what wise people in the past have said about happiness. And if so far we've got a true view, then what people in the past find about happiness should in some way harmonize with our view of what happiness is so far. Does that make sense? I just had to throw that quote in there because it's one of my favorite quotes of his, because that gives you such a perfect sense of Aristotle's thinking. With a true view, all the data harmonize, but with a false one, the facts soon clash. That's like his methodology. Anyways, so he does a classification of goods by past philosophers. So by past philosophers, they classify goods as external goods, bodily goods, and then goods of the soul. An example of an external good, that's wealth, that's friendship, that's, you might consider your living circumstances as part of your wealth, or maybe you don't, I don't know. But the external goods, right? Food, water, things you need. And then bodily goods, like your health. And then finally goods of the soul, like virtue.
Okay.
Of these, the goods of the soul are supreme, according to the past philosophers. In general, past philosophers claim, here's the things that you want: virtue, prudence, wisdom, pleasure, and external goods. Sorry, I said that word. In general, past philosophers claim virtue, prudence, wisdom, pleasure, and external goods are all associated with happiness, and it is not probable to Aristotle that they are completely wrong. So he says, whatever our view of happiness is, and however we're going to define this thing, it probably needs to take into account virtue, prudence, wisdom, pleasure, and external goods.
Okay.
And so if our position is going to harmonize with what past wisdom has thought, it needs to at least account for these things. Make sure we briefly understand each of these. Virtue, we'll do a deeper analysis into that, but virtues are basically going to be good habits. Courage is a virtue. Prudence is wisdom with practical matters. We'll do a deeper dive into prudence, but prudence is a type of wisdom you expect an elderly person to have. Wisdom is a type of wisdom now you expect someone who's done a lot of like logic, math, and science to have.
That's
Not necessarily the wisdom of experience, but
So he says prudence is like the wisdom of experience, and
wisdom of experience, and then wisdom is like
knowledge.
the knowledge you obtain, theoretical knowledge.
Okay.
All right? Practical knowledge, theoretical knowledge. And then pleasure, that was pretty self-explanatory, and then external goods. That's also pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so our view of happiness needs to somehow have all these come into the picture. Otherwise, we're probably off. With me? Okay. So, let's paint the picture. So with those who identify happiness with virtue, or some one virtue, our account is obviously in harmony. What was our definition of happiness? It was activity in the soul in accordance with virtue. The excellent activity of the soul, of the rational soul.
Yeah.
So virtue obviously comes with that. For to virtue belongs virtuous activity, and we defined it as a type of virtuous activity. Now he points out that virtue might not be enough, and he likes that he puts virtuous activity here, because the chief good is not just the possession of virtue, which is just potentiality, but it's the actualization of virtue, which is, I didn't mean to put virtuous activity there, I meant actuality. So he's saying, what's better? To just be honest, but asleep, or to be honest and acting honestly?
Last one.
The last one, when you're actually actualizing that virtue. So he likes that he added on virtuous activity rather than just saying having a virtue makes you happy. He doesn't like calling someone who sleeps their whole life, who gets virtues and sleeps away the rest of their life, knowing that they have those virtues, as a happy person. thinks you're happier if you're actively exercising those virtues. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Since a virtuous person takes pleasure in virtuous actions, then their life is also pleasant in and of itself. So we got virtue in our definition for sure, right? He's going through that list that we saw before. How does our definition include pleasure? He says, well, at the very least, a person who's a virtuous person takes pleasure in their virtuous activities. A just person enjoys being just. An honest person enjoys being honest. There's a pleasure in it. And they also enjoy witnessing it, he says. So not only does a just person actually get pleasure out of being just, they get pleasure out of seeing other just people be just. So they do live a life that has pleasure. So pleasure does come into the picture, at least in that way so far.
Okay.
Good? And then, along with the same virtue here, he's going to put prudence and wisdom as a type of virtue. He's going to call those intellectual virtues. So virtue here takes care from the previous slide, virtue, prudence, and wisdom. Here we took care of pleasure, and now we need to take care of external goods and see how that fits into our picture. With me?
Yeah.
Okay. Finally, since activity is necessary to a happy life, or at least activity enables you to be even happier than before. Well, happiness is the ultimate end, so the way we said it here is fine. So finally, since activity is necessary to a happy life, the external goods which help to enable virtuous activity are also necessary. So since virtuous action is a good, then you need the external goods which enable you to act virtuously. So for example, if you're a slave, that greatly impedes upon your ability to act virtuously. You have very little choice over your own actions. That's bad. That prevents you from living a happy life. You're far better off not a slave.
Yeah.
If you don't have any wealth, so you spend your whole life barely making ends meet, and your whole life is focused around just making ends meet, then you don't have a whole lot of time for other virtuous activity. So, since we're talking about virtuous activity, and since there are external goods which help you to act, help enable you to act better, then external goods which help to enable virtuous activity are also necessary. For it is impossible, or not easy, to do noble acts without the proper equipment. For which reason some identify happiness with good fortune, though others identify it with virtue. So some think happiness is good fortune just because if life goes good for you and you get those external goods, then you're able to live a virtuous life. Aristotle says, yeah, kind of, it helps because you do need some amount of external goods to live a good life because they help you. They help to enable virtuous activity. That's why the external goods are there. And virtuous activity is what leads to happiness. So once again, we've accounted for external goods, which the past philosopher says contributes to a happy life. So we accounted for all those things. And we've seen how in Aristotle's picture of happiness, all those play a part. There's pleasure, there's external goods, and there's the virtues. Good so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So then he wants to know, okay, so how is happiness actually acquired? Is happiness then acquired by learning, habituation, some other sort of training, or is it just a consequence of chance and good fortune? As a thought experiment, they knew of people who were great men and lived very happy lives, you would say, who had children that then lived terrible lives. And one of the common questions is, why do great men have terrible children? Couldn't they have taught their kids somehow to live virtuous lives like they did? What does it take to ensure that your child lives a virtuous life? So that's kind of the puzzle that they're working on here. It's one that we brought up with already when we talked about Plato. So what is it exactly that produces happiness? For Aristotle, all these could play some role, but he claims happiness as being a virtuous activity of soul. Happiness is a virtuous activity of soul of a certain kind. Of the remaining goods, some must necessarily pre-exist as conditions of happiness, and others are naturally cooperative and useful as instruments. So while all these things do help, ultimately, what produces happiness is virtuous activity of soul. Ultimately, the person has to choose. It's going to bring choice into the picture. The activity of your soul, those are the things you choose to do. The rational part of your soul, the way you think, the things you conclude to do.
He says some must pre-exist those.
Yes, some must pre-exist. So for example, you can't exercise virtues if I make you a slave. That's a pre-existing condition. You need to be free if you're going to exercise virtue.
Okay.
You need to be alive if you're going to exercise virtue. Go back to our Declaration of Independence. What's Thomas Jefferson say? Very Aristotelian of him. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he says life and liberty are pre-existing conditions for a person pursuing their happiness.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, so now when can we call a man happy? Since many changes may occur in life, we cannot call a man happy until the end, or at least close to the end, when it's very, very unlikely that something's going to be fallen. We already used the example of a football game. Do we call them happy when they are dead? Then happiness is not an activity of soul. So now he's in a little bit of a weird spot. He doesn't like it. He says, we're saying someone has to die before you can call him happy, but then we said happiness is an activity of soul, and when they're dead, there's no activity of soul. See what he doesn't like? And ultimately, how's he going to compensate for that? He's going to say, we call them happy when they've achieved happiness and it's basically impossible for them to decline beyond happiness. Okay. So since happiness is related to virtues, and since these seem most durable in man, we can be assured that the man cultivating them will most likely be happy. So virtues now, once again, sorry, he does this a bit, jumping back and forth how he uses virtues. Virtues here, he's talking about habits once again. He's saying that your habits are pretty much the most persistent thing about you. If I can get you the virtue of courage, or temperance, we'll pick temperance. If I can get you the virtue of temperance, and I teach you algebra, which of those persists longer? The habit.
What do you mean?
Temperance.
One persists longer?
Imagine you develop a habit for something. A very strong habit for something.
Okay.
Now imagine I teach you algebra. 50 years, I give you an algebra test. How well do you do? Probably not great.
Yeah.
50 years from now, I check to see if you have the habit. Most likely.
Okay.
So, virtues, meaning the virtues of habit here now, seem to be the most persistent thing about a person. Nothing persists like your habits. Not even your knowledge persists like your habits. Habits seem to just persist. They seem to be the most durable thing. And since your happiness is dependent upon these virtues, then cultivating them will most likely cause you to be happy. It will be very hard to deteriorate your happiness. It's very hard to take a habit out of you. Make sense? Okay. So since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. So now we're going to talk about the virtues, and moral virtues and intellectual virtues is going to be a split. I'm not sure what I was saying before. Anyways, so going back what I said with psychology, the three parts of the soul. Aristotle divides the soul into three parts. The vegetative part, which takes no part in virtuous action. That's the part of you that you share with plants. Right? No action involved. The appetitive part of you, which has desires. Now, those desires can sometimes cause you to commit unvirtuous actions, and sometimes they can cause you to commit virtuous actions. So virtue does come into play here. And then the rational part of your soul, which reasons. And obviously, how you make your choices, how you reason, has a huge effect on virtue. So virtue seems only concerned with these two parts of the soul, nothing here.
Okay.
Make sense with that? Okay. So as there are two parts of the soul concerned with virtue, these two parts, so are there two types of virtues. And he's going to call them the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues. And the moral virtues are going to be about getting the appetitive part of your soul under control. And the intellectual virtues are going to be about developing the rational part of your soul. Right?
Okay.
So temperance, that's not letting pleasure dictate to you left and right, right? And then wisdom, or obtaining knowledge, that's here. Let's give you an example of each. Okay, So we're going to go over the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. We'll do the moral virtues first and then the intellectual virtues. But not yet, I guess. Okay. Quote from Aristotle. Virtue, then, being of two kinds, intellect and moral. Intellectual virtue is, in the main, owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. Whence also its name, ethike, is one that is formed from a slight variation from the word ethos, which is the word for habit. So we get ethics from ethos, from habit.
Oh, I see.
So basically, you got some young kid. When you have some young kid, you can't start teaching them about all the intellectual virtues, but you can instantly start establishing in them good habits and helping them to develop good habits. So actually saying that. Say that one more time. Virtue, then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue, in the main, owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. And then he points out its name. So you start that one immediately. Make sense? Then none of the moral virtues exist in us by nature, as a thing cannot be habituated against its nature. So here's where he's building up his argument that you're not born good or evil because you're not born with any habits. By nature, well, just say it again. That none of the moral virtues exist in us by nature, as a thing cannot be habituated against its nature. And the example he gives is, you can try to habituate a stone to fall upwards as much as you want. Its nature requires it to come down. And you can't train something against its nature. So virtues and vices were already in us as a part of nature. We couldn't be habituated otherwise. So the fact that we can be habituated otherwise means it's not built into our nature. I can't habituate you not to breathe, because it's built into your nature that you have to breathe. There's no choice about it. So since you can be habituated about these things, since they're habits, and you can be habituated about them, one way or another, they're not built into your nature. There's choice there. Make sense? Okay. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, or to reject them. So, we're the ones that decide whether we're virtuous or not. You're not born evil, you're not born good. If you end up bad, that's because of your choices. And if you end up good, that's because of your choices. So the virtue vice comes to us by exercising them. In the same way that a good, bad lyre player is produced by playing the lyre, so too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, unjust by doing unjust acts, untemperate by doing untemperate acts. By exercising those types of acts that we become those types of people. You're not born that way. Make sense? Now, going back to the categories, in the categories, one of the things we discussed was the different types of ways that we use the word opposite. You might kind of vaguely remember that discussion. We discussed how the contrary of a good is always evil, but that the contrary of an evil may or may not be good. The example we used was defect and excess. So words that have contraries, to just give us a quick reminder, because it's not necessarily the opposite. What's the contrary of white?
Black.
Black. What's the opposite of white?
Black.
Black, I guess. Right? But you could also do the negation of white, meaning not white.
Yeah.
So contrary isn't the same thing as the negation, right? The contrary of white, you naturally want to say black. The contrary, or the negation of white, is not white. So similarly, with the good, its contrary is always bad, but the contrary of the bad isn't necessarily good. And the example we used before was excess and defect. So a really simple example, if we say that this is the right amount of food for you to eat, so this is a good amount, then if you eat this much food, that's bad. And if you eat this much food, that's bad. So what's the contrary of the just right amount of food? Well, you have to say either too much or too little, right? Mm-hmm. But what's the contrary of too much food? You might say too little. And what's the contrary of too little food? You might say too much.
I see.
So the contrary of a good is always a bad, however you want to think about it. But the contrary of a bad isn't necessarily a good. And this was one example he gave to help you think about it. Remember that? So we're going to be pulling that out of the categories and using that same thing here in his ethics. So, notice that what that kind of forces to happen is in the cases, it can be the case where the contrary of a good is a bad and the contrary of a bad is a good. There can be cases where that happens. But there can also be cases where that doesn't happen. Where the contrary of a good is bad, but the contrary of a bad is still bad. You with me? So all the moral virtues he's going to demonstrate can be placed on the spectrum, where the good is here, and then the bad is here and here. And he's going to place moral virtues on a spectrum like this. So for example, he's going to say that the virtue, so relative to confidence and fear, he's going to say if you feel the right way about confidence and fear, he's going to call you a courageous person. You have courage. Right? And if we say that this is your, well, confidence and fear are kind of opposed to each other. We'll say this side is high confidence, no fear. This side is no confidence, high fear. The person on this end of the spectrum then is a coward, right? Coward, someone who feels way too much fear, not enough confidence. And then on this side of the spectrum, can't remember what we're going to call it.
Foolhardy, I think.
Foolhardy, something like that. Something foolhardy, a rash person. Someone way too confident and not feeling enough fear. There's things that you ought to fear if you're going to preserve your life. It's stupid not to fear them, right? You don't need to run naked through a building full of glass and nails and whatever. Probably not smart. So that's one example. So he's going to point out that all the moral virtues can be placed on a spectrum like this, where what's the contrary of courage? We typically say coward, because typically humans are further on this side of the spectrum. So we typically say coward, but you could also say the rash person. But what's the contrary of the rash person? The coward. And what's the contrary of the coward? The rash person. So it's using that same thing from the categories that we're going to use to talk about these moral virtues, and we're always going to place them on a spectrum. And he's going to point out with moral virtues, they're always in this mean, this middle point between two vices. And it's called Plato's doctrine of the golden mean. Anyways, oh, I wrote it right there. Coward, courage, rash. Okay. So Aristotle places each of the moral virtues on a spectrum, advocating the mean as the virtue, and the excess and defect as vice. Coward, courage, rash. People become habituated well by first performing actions that are virtuous, possibly because of some guidance. All right? Your child might first perform a virtuous action because you're kind of pushing the child to do it. You tell them, clean up your room. They say, I don't want to. You say, tough, clean up your room. Kind of push them to develop good habits. So people become habituated well by first performing actions that are virtuous, possibly because of some guidance. And in turn, these habitual actions then start to become virtues when deliberately chosen. So I can start by training my child by forcing them to clean up their room and pushing them to do it every time. And after enough time, they start choosing of their own free will and accord to start cleaning up their room. And that's how I know, okay, the habit's forming. And they're becoming a little bit more virtuous.
Okay.
Make sense? One point I didn't put in here, but should probably mention it really quick when we're talking about this spectrum. Aristotle also makes a recommendation for you. He says, you know yourself. You know if you're closer to this side of the spectrum or this side of the spectrum. He says, so recognize where you stand on the spectrum relative to each of them, not just courage, but relative to each of them. And try and force yourself to the side that you know you're not on. He says, think about it. If I had a bent stick, so we'll say this stick bends this way, so say you personally know that you're more of a coward. You say, try and force yourself to be more on the rash side, like you're straightening out a stick, and when you let go, you'll probably be close to where you want to be. So some practical advice that he gives.
Okay.
Okay. Guess we're not listing out all the virtues. Okay. All the moral virtues are concerned with pleasures and pains. The intellectual virtues, not so much, but all the moral virtues are concerned with pleasures and pains. They all have to do with the appetitive part of your soul. The appetitive part of your soul only cares about pleasures and pains. So initially, choosing virtuous action may cause us pain. Right? And when we say pain here, we don't necessarily mean physical pain. If I ask you, what's 197 times 276? Do it in your head. You resist doing that because it causes you mental pains. So that would be classified as a pain. Something that you have to force yourself to do, exerts, tiring, you naturally don't want to do it, you don't get pleasure out of it, you get pain out of it. So we're not just talking about physical pain here. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so initially, choosing virtuous action may cause us some pain. As we become habituated towards virtuous actions, they will begin to cause us pleasure, and their corresponding vices will begin to cause us pain. Right? If I force you to wake up early every day at 7 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 7 o'clock, at first you don't want to wake up at 7 o'clock. But then you get in the habit of waking up at 7 o'clock, and now it's pain for you if I tell you now you have to stay in bed until 8. Because there you are at 7 o'clock, and you want to get out of bed, and you just have to sit there for an hour. It's a painful thing for you to stay in bed longer than 7 o'clock now.
Yeah.
Where at first it's a painful thing for you to get up at 7 o'clock, or whatever it is. Hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought. For this is the right education. So he's basically giving you advice on how you raise your kids. How do you raise your kids? You try to make so that they experience pains at the right things and pleasures at the right things. So if your child does something to experience pleasure, make sure you come back with more pain than the pleasure they experienced. And it'll be that pain that helps to correct them. So your child's acting absurd for attention, give them the pains of no attention. You put them in a timeout or whatever. Basic stuff we already know. But remember, this whole book, I didn't say it at the beginning, but he says, you don't become a virtuous person by reading works on ethics. You become a virtuous person by practicing. So he's trying to give you practical advice for you to actually go exercise. Yeah. He doesn't want you to just read the book and say, now I'm a virtuous person. He says, no, you're not. You're not a virtuous person until you commit virtuous acts. Go out and actually commit the actions. So it's by reason of pleasure and pains that men become bad by pursuing pleasure when they ought not, or by avoiding pain when they ought not. That's typically why people become bad. It's because they were pursuing some pleasure when they shouldn't have, or they were trying to avoid some pain when they shouldn't have. So you got to teach them how to take pleasures and pains in the right way and in the right things. Okay, so Aristotle distinguishes 3 things found in the soul: passions, faculties, and states of character. Now this is kind of weird, so let's make sense of it. Passions are all your emotions, like anger, frustration, desires, all those are passions. Faculties are abilities to experience those. So you have a faculty for anger because it's possible for you to experience passion, anger.
Okay.
Make sense? And then finally, states of character is your disposition towards your passions. So you can feel anger, you have a faculty for feeling anger, and then your disposition towards, you have your disposition towards anger. Do you way overindulge it, or do you have it under control? And that's a state. He's going to say that states of character, that's what virtue has to do. Okay, as we are neither blamed nor praised for our passions, no one blames or praises you because you're angry. Everyone gets angry. Nor are you blamed or praised for your faculties. No one blames or praises you because you're able to get angry. What they do is they blame you or praise you based off of what you do with that anger. The choices you make based off of that anger. Virtue must then be a state of character and not a passion or faculty, because we praise or blame people based off of their virtues. Right? You're blamed for being vicious. You're praised for being virtuous. You're not praised or blamed for this. You're not praised or blamed for this. So virtue must be a state of character, which you are praised or blamed for. In moral virtue, there is excess, defect, and the intermediates. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger, and pity, and in general pleasure and pain may be felt too much and too little. So he just really listed out a bunch of passions here. So here he's listing out a bunch of passions. Both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger, and pity, and in general pleasure and pain, he's listing out all the possible passions, may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to fill them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best. And this is the characteristic of virtue. So it's hard to exercise your passions in a virtuous way. It's hard for you to exercise your anger with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way. That's a difficult thing to do. So he's pointing out the good is hard. Or obtaining the virtues, that's a hard thing, but being evil is easy. For men are good in but one way, but bad in many ways. So, while all virtues can be viewed as a mean between two vices, not every action or passion admits of a mean. Say that another way, every virtue is a mean, but not every mean is a virtue. This is one of the ways that people attack Aristotle, and I don't understand it because he makes his point quite clear. He's just pointing out all moral virtues are a mean, not every mean is a moral virtue. He doesn't say, well, you could never commit adultery, and you could commit adultery every day, therefore the right amount is the mean, committing adultery every other day. Right? He's not saying just because you take two vices, I guess never committing adultery isn't a vice. Committing adultery once, that's bad. Committing adultery 100 times, that's bad. He doesn't say just because you get two vices, then their mean is magically a virtue. All he's doing is pointing out that with moral virtues, there are always a mean between two vices. So he's saying if it's a moral virtue, then it's a mean. He's not saying if it's a mean, then it's a moral virtue. And people try to take issue with Aristotle's ethics by saying, oh, what about his, they call it his golden mean rule, the rule of the golden mean. And they give these examples where they think just because they found a mean, now Aristotle thinks it's a virtue. It's not close to what he says. Anyways, so every virtue, meaning every moral virtue, is a mean, but not every mean is a moral virtue. And so, even his own examples, what's a mean relative to adultery? Or what's a golden mean relative to adultery? What's the right amount of adultery? So that's an absurd question. You're talking about something that's bad. And so actions like adultery, theft, murder, etc. have no associated virtue. There isn't the right amount of it. So the virtues are means, not all means are virtues. Next, it would be equally absurd then to expect that in unjust, cowardly, and voluptuous actions, there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. For at that rate, there would be a mean of excess and a deficiency, or a mean of excess of deficiency, and an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. So what he's saying is, so pick one of those, like we talked about coward. So he said, we already made our branch where we had coward, we had courage, and we had rash, right? He's saying now to look at coward, and look at the mean relative to that, is to look at the mean of an excess. He's saying it's absurd to do that. Okay? So it would be equally absurd then to expect that, just focus on cowardly. Cowardly actions should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. So we don't look at the excess of the cowardly action, the deficiency of the cowardly action. It's already a deficiency. And then we'd be looking for a deficiency of deficiency, or an excess of deficiency. So not only is he saying all his moral virtues are a mean, but he's saying what he makes them a mean between, you can't talk about means of, because they're already extremes. Make sense? So don't talk about things like adultery, which he's not even claiming have any sort of mean for him. They're already bad. And don't talk about means relative to his extremes, because they're already extremes. Anyways, so moral virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean as determined by a rational principle relative to the actor. Let's make sure we understand all that now. Moral virtue is a state of character. We got that one. It's not the passions you experience, it's how you act on them.
Yeah.
Concerned with choice, you can't be blamed or praised for what you don't choose to do. It's choices that form habits, your virtues are habits. Lying in a mean, as determined by a rational principle, we'll see how they all lie in a mean. We don't have that up yet. I have a picture of all his virtues and showing how they lie in a mean. But they're between two extremes, as determined by some rational principle. So you don't look for it with adultery. And then relative to the actor. Finally, that relative to the actor part means what's good for you isn't necessarily good for me. If I say that 100 calories for Peter is too little, and 10,000 calories for Peter is too much, that doesn't necessarily mean that take the exact average of those, which is 5,050 calories, is just right for Peter. You with me? All we know is that was just right for Peter is somewhere in between. Let's use a more extreme example. How many calories do you need a day? We'll say somewhere between 0 and 10,000. Right? Now, for someone like me who hardly ever moves, I program for a living, I'm probably closer to this spectrum. If you're out there doing dirty works all day, Peter's probably right here, and that's the right amount for him. Now, both of us are on a mean between not enough food and too much food, but the right amount for me and the right amount for you are not the same thing. And so the exact right amount is relative to the actor.
Yeah, but does that apply to the virtues?
Yes. When you're saying how much. Look, part of virtue is not overeating, or part of temperance is not overeating. What's overeating for me isn't necessarily overeating for you. If I ate as much as you did, I'd be overeating.
Okay.
So the point is to eat as much as you need, based on a rational principle, relative to yourself. Eat as much as you need, and then if you eat more than you need, that's bad. And what you need and what I need depends on who we're talking about. It's relative to the person. So it's not a relative ethics. There is an objective amount of food that you need. It just depends on who we're talking about to determine how much food that is.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Okay, so here's all his moral virtues now, finally listed out. Here's a sphere of action or feeling. So in other words, the passion related to it. Here's the excess of that passion. Here's the mean. So here's the actual virtues. This column's the virtues. And then here's the deficiencies. Make sense?
Okay.
So let's just go across it. Relative to fear and confidence, if you have an excess, you're a rash person. If you feel just right, you're a courageous person. And if you feel too much, you're a coward. We've already done that one before. Okay, relative to pleasures and pains, that's the way it's just plugged into here on the table, but he means in particularly eating, drinking, and sex for this one. So if you do it in excess, you're a licentious person or a self-indulging person. If you do it the moderate amount, because you do need those things, you're a temperate person. And if you completely avoid it, like an old Christian monk, you're an insensible person. Like old Christian monks, they take their food and then they sprinkle ash on it so it didn't have any good flavor. Because they didn't want to take pleasure in their food. And Aristotle was saying, how stupid of you. You had a chance to enjoy that food and you just wasted it. You just cut some pleasure out of your life. So there's a right amount and a wrong amount. There can be too much, too little, and the right amount. Getting and spending. The prodigal. We all know the story of the prodigal son, the wasteful son, right? And then there's the liberal man who gives to the right sources the right amount at the right times. He doesn't waste his money. He makes sure that he has money to take care of the things that he needs to spend his money on, but spends his money on the things that he needs to spend his money on. And then there's the mean man who just hoards his money, or the illiberal man. That was minor getting and spending. Then they have major getting and spending. This one because it was common for wealthy citizens to perform honors for the state. So it was common that a private citizen would do something like put statues in a temple or something like that. So since that was a common thing, he also had one relative to great spendings. So the great spending person, the one who goes way overboard, is the vulgar person or the tasteless person. The one who does it just right is the magnificent person. And then the one who doesn't do it enough is the petty or the stingy person. Okay. Relative to receiving honors and dishonors, the person who takes it in excess is the vain person, vanity. The person who does it just right is the magnanimous person, so magnanimity. And then the person who does it in deficiency, they put pusillanimity here, that's like a excessively timid due to a lack of desire.
Drive, you would say?
Drive. There you go. Okay. Drive is the right word. And then honors and dishonors now on the minor scale. So that was a major scale. This is a minor scale. And then the person who has it too much, we call the ambitious person. The person in the right amount, proper ambitious or proper pride. And then finally on the far right, we have the undue humble person. He points out how these two people are kind of oddly the same, the ambitious person and the unduly humble person, because the unduly humble person is often unduly humble to get praised for being unduly humble. And so there's a type of pride associated with being unduly humble.
Does he make humility as a virtue?
No, proper pride for proper ambition. Pride's a good thing.
So he makes pride as a virtue, not humility.
It makes pride as a virtue. Not ambition or empty vanity, but proper pride. Yes, there's a proper pride.
Okay.
And then relative to anger, you have the irascible person, the person who's getting upset at everything. Then you have the patient or the good-tempered person, who doesn't get angry quickly. And then you have the person who completely lacks any spirit at all and never gets angry at anything. Self-expression, you have the boastful person. In the mean, you have a truthful person. And then in the deficiency, you have a modest person, someone who understates it. Next, in conversation, he put conversation here, but it's more like leisure conversation. Conversation meant for the sake of enjoyment, or just leisure socializing. It's probably the best way to put it there.
Hanging out.
So this would include, yeah, hanging out, but also like watching a play or something like that.
Oh, I see.
So a social type of leisure, but conversation was the most common that they had. So conversation. The person excessive here in conversation is the buffoon, one who will try to entertain at any expense and do anything to try and get a laugh and entertain in any way. Then you have just the witty person, who's able to be classy in the way that they exercise humor. And then you have the boorish person who can't find humor in anything, can't enjoy anything. Next, relative to social conduct, you have the obsequious person. So that's like a bootlicker. Someone going around.
Oh, Donnie, you're just the most awesome teacher.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And it's also like with a massive obedience element to it. Like my dog is obsequious relative to me. My dog, when I walk in the room, that dog's just paying attention to me. And if I tell it to come to me, it'll run and come to me as fast as it can. If I tell it to go back to its bed, it'll run and go back to its bed as fast as it can.
Okay.
A fairly servile person. And then the proper one is friendliness. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're friends with each other. It's just friendliness. I think we have good intuition for that. And then finally, the cantankerous person, who isn't so pleasant to be around. Trying to think of a good description there. Scrooge. But like, almost no regard for you or anything you say or do. So over-regarding you, under-regarding you, treating you.
Would it not be like a selfish person?
More like a self-centered.
Okay, yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Next one, shame. Shame, if you feel shame in excess, that produces shyness. If you feel shame the right way, that will cause you to be more modest. And then if you feel shame to an extreme, and then in the deficiency is a shameless person. They don't feel shame at all. That one makes pretty good sense, right? Mm-hmm. And then finally, with indignation, you have the envious person. Envy, you want the things that that other person has. You wish you were them. You want it. You have righteous indignation, is his best term for it. A lot of these terms, he makes up the words for it because there isn't a word in the Greek language for it. So he puts a compound like this, saying that we don't really have a good middle ground for a word on this. So sometimes when you see those compound words, it's because there isn't really a word for it. Like we had a word for ambition, and he had a word for undue humility, and then he had to come up with like a proper ambition or proper pride. That's something in between.
Okay.
Anyways, same thing going on here. So you have the envious person, the person with righteous indignation, and then you have the malicious person or the spiteful person. So the envious person, they wish that they had what it is. So imagine you saw someone get something that you thought they shouldn't have it. All right, the envious person wants it. The person with righteous indignation recognizes they shouldn't have that. And then the spiteful person will be spiteful when they have it, and if they ever lose it, will take a malicious sort of enjoyment out of the fact that you somehow lost something. So.
Okay.
And then that's roughly his outline of his moral virtues, his virtues of good habit. And you could look up other tables for these and see different words plugged in here because there's a lot of different ways of translating some of these words. Now, one word I want to point out here is this line, magnanimity. Aristotle views this as the chief virtue, the crowning virtue, the virtue of virtues. You'll know that you have achieved all these if you have become a magnanimous man, if you can achieve the virtue of magnanimity, if you can receive major honors and receive major honors from sources that you would recognize taking major honors from. So people that you recognize as being virtuous people are giving you great honors. And if you approach that the right way, then you're a magnanimous person. And he has a lot more to say about magnanimity, so we'll jump into that here just a little bit. So this is going to be a way cut down extraction of probably Aristotle's most famous piece of his ethics. And it's so famous it's called The Magnanimous Man. And it's a big long quotation, The Magnanimous Man, where Aristotle is describing the magnanimous man. And I should note, he describes in details all the things that we just covered. We're not going to. We just did as much as we're going to except for magnanimity. With me?
Okay.
Okay, so the magnanimous man. The magnanimous man does not expose himself needlessly to danger, since there are few things for which he cares sufficiently, but he is willing, in great crisis, to give even his life, knowing that under certain conditions it is not worth while to live. He is of a disposition to do men service, though he is ashamed to have a service done to him. To confirm a kindness is a mark of superiority, to receive one is a mark of subordination. He does not take part in public displays. He is open in his dislikes and preferences. He talks and acts frankly, because of his contempt for men and things. He is never fired with admiration, since there is nothing great in his eyes. He cannot live in complacence with others, except to be a friend, someone who's his equal in virtue. We haven't come across friendship yet, but when you're a friend, a proper friend is someone equal to you in virtue. Complacence is a characteristic of a slave. He never feels malice and always forgets and passes over injuries. He is not fond of talking. It is no concern of his that he should be praised or that others should be blamed. He does not speak evil of others, even of his enemies, unless it be to themselves. His carriage, like his way that he kind of holds himself, is sedate, his voice deep, his speech measured. He is not given to hurry, for he is concerned about only a few things. He is not prone to vehemence, acting out with strong emotion, for he thinks nothing very important. A shrill voice and a hasty step comes to a man through care. He bears the accidents of life with dignity and grace, making the best of his circumstances, like a skillful general who marshals his limited forces with the strategy of war. He is his own best friend and takes delight in privacy, whereas the man of no virtue or ability is his own worst enemy and is afraid of solitude. Now, that's a little bit of his most famous quote, or most famous little extract, the magnanimous man. Do you have any questions about any of that? One that might have been weird here, his voice deep. When he says deep there, he doesn't mean necessarily that you have a deep voice. He means your voice isn't high-pitched because you're not rushing. A person who's in control, their voice is naturally deeper than if they're rushing around. So that's what he meant there. Anything else that sounded weird in that? All right. Next. To attain a virtue, it is not enough to just perform the virtuous actions, in Aristotle's mind. You must deliberately choose to perform the action. So Aristotle divides actions into 3 types. We have voluntary actions. Those are intentional actions where the outcome is pretty much what you expected. So that was pretty self-explanatory. This was also pretty self-explanatory. Involuntary or unwilling actions, those are basically when you make a mistake, you have an accident. Like if I were to throw this chalk up into the air and it hits the ceiling and a piece shoots off and shot into your eye, that was an involuntary or unwilling action. I did not mean to shoot the chalk into your eye, even though I did it.
Yeah.
That was a complete accident. And so with voluntary actions, we blame and praise people based off of their voluntary actions. If they choose to do something good, we praise them. If they choose to do something bad, we blame them. With involuntary or unwilling actions, we don't praise and blame them. We say, if it was something good that happened, we say you got lucky. And if it was something bad that happened, we say, wow, that was pretty unlucky. And you just feel bad for him. Right? Finally, there's a third type of action, which he calls, now he just has to make up something to call it, non-voluntary or non-willing actions. And these are actions where you choose the least bad option, and he gives a couple examples. He says, imagine you're a ship's captain, and you're taking a bunch of luggage across the sea for some merchant. Storm comes along, and you think that the ship's going to sink if you don't dump all his merchandise. So you dump all the merchant's merchandise to save the ship. Now he would call this a non-voluntary or non-willing action. It wasn't an accident, you intentionally did it, you knew what you were doing, but under normal circumstances you would have never chosen to just dump that merchant's luggage overboard. You did it because you were choosing the least bad option available to you. Because in your mind it was, my crew drowns, or I dumped this luggage. And so you chose the least bad option. Another example he gives is a common thing that happened in Greece was tyrants coming to power. Common thing a tyrant would do is tell you to go commit some shameful act or they were going to kill your family. So he says in that situation, now a person is forced to commit a non-voluntary or a non-willing action. It's not that they would normally have gone and done that shameful action, like betray some of their friends, but they were choosing in their mind what was the least bad option. So he says it's universally accepted that we praise and blame here. It's pretty universally accepted that we don't praise and blame here. Here it's kind of mixed. And you can get some people who say one way and some people who say another way. With me? Mm-hmm. So the first case we obviously praise and blame people for. The second we pity them for if it was negative. We say they were lucky if it was positive. But the third is not so obvious. So Aristotle says we have these 3. Nonetheless, of these 3 actions, we all agree that it's these types of actions that do the most to form habits, and it's these type of actions that do the most to form virtues. Okay? These do the most to determine your state of character. So those are the types of actions there are. Now we're going to talk about a deliberate choice. What's a deliberate choice or a true choice? A deliberate choice or a true choice is one done with deliberation. We misuse this word deliberate from how it was initially used. When you think someone did something deliberately, you just think intentionally. That's not what deliberate means. Deliberate means some deliberation went into it. You deliberated the choice and came to that conclusion. Not just you intentionally did it, you deliberately did it. You contemplated the decision, thought about it, came to that conclusion. Okay. Right? Huge difference. And it's important that you get that difference. Consider the pros and cons, you really thought about the decision, and then you deliberately made a choice. After deliberating, you made your choice. A deliberate choice. That's what he means by a deliberate choice or a true choice. So he's saying these are the types of choices that are the most significant when it comes to forming your character. A deliberate choice, true choice, is one done with deliberation and not a spur-of-the-moment decision. 2 different things. Even though a spur-of-the-moment decision can still be an intentional action. So we're not just interested in voluntary actions. We're not just interested in voluntary actions or intentional actions. We're mostly interested in the ones you do deliberately. The ones you gave some deliberation to and you still made that choice. If you made a bad choice in the spur of the moment, that's not near as bad as if you made a bad choice after a lot of deliberation. Example, difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder. First-degree murder is premeditated murder. You deliberately killed them. Second-degree murder could have been caught up in a passion, caught up in anger. You were just in a fight, and then you killed them that way. I think. First degree is a bad one, right? Not third. All right. Anyways, so difference between a deliberate choice and a spur-of-the-moment choice. So to obtain a moral virtue, it is not enough just to want or wish to do good. It's not enough to just have wanted or wished to do good. So that could have been your, what's that? What's the word there? When you consider someone's motive, your motive, what you wanted to do, what you wish to do. So to attain a moral virtue is not enough just to want or to wish to do good. While wishes are concerned with ends, you only wish for an end, right?
Yeah.
Deliberation is concerned with means. You may wish to be happy, but you do not deliberate about whether or not you want to be happy. You deliberate about how you could be happy. Deliberation is about means. Wants and wishes are for ends. You want or wish for a particular end. Deliberation is about the means to attain that end. So you deliberate about the right means to achieve certain ends, in particularly happiness. See the difference between wants and wish, or wishing something and then deliberating about something? Those are two different things.
Yeah.
And it's a deliberation, the deliberate choices that have the most effect on your character, how virtuous you are, not your wishes. So the fact that you wish to do good isn't near as relevant as the deliberate choices that you make. Make sense? Okay. So deliberation concerns possible human actions. We don't deliberate about the impossible. We might deliberate about, I don't know, something you deliberate about all the time. You're in school and you've got some project and you might deliberate about who does which part of the project. That's deliberation. None of you deliberate about whether or not the teacher should do the whole project for you, because that's not in the realm of possibility.
Okay.
You only deliberate about what you could actually possibly do. So deliberation concerns possible human action, and occurs when the outcome is unclear and the right way to act is undefined. I think that should be an or. When the outcome is unclear or the right way to act is undefined. We do not deliberate about something like a mathematical proof where it's perfectly well understood. You and I don't deliberate about the Pythagorean theorem. We just do the proof. And then we're all agreed when it's all said and done. So deliberation is more messy. We have to deliberate when we're talking about practical matters, how people should act. There isn't some proof for what you should do right now. And so the best we can do, we can't use proof, we have to use just deliberation. Deliberation is about actions we can take. We can take actions to promote certain ends or goals, therefore we deliberate to promote certain ends or goals. So our deliberation promotes certain ends or goals. That's what we do in deliberation. And so deliberation can lead to us promoting happiness. Now Aristotle points out, as people might say, oh, well, I wish to do good in that action. Aristotle points out, well, people don't really wish to do good. They don't really wish for the good. What they wish for is the apparent good, what appears good to them. They can be mistaken about the good. And so they also need to have a right education about what the good is. While no one is willingly unhappy, they can deliberately make choices that lead them to be unhappy. They can intentionally choose to be vicious people. So they didn't want to be unhappy. No one says, I wish I were unhappy right now. But they can deliberately make the choices that lead them to be unhappy. They can intentionally choose to be vicious people. They are mistaken about the course of life that will produce happiness. They think some certain end or goal, they deliberate about it, they think that this will make them happier in the end. They're mistaken, they're wrong. And so they make a bad choice. One possible scenario. What?
So what he's saying is there's really not truly an evil person out there.
Oh, there definitely is. They just define happiness different from you. And they think, what will make me happy? Stealing all your money and killing people I don't like. They're wrong. It's going to make them unhappy. So they intentionally chose vice, thinking that vice would make them happy. And they're wrong about that.
Well, if they're
They still chose vice. They still
intentionally
chose.
trying to choose happiness for themselves, what they think it is that evil?
Is it evil to choose evil because you think evil will make you happy?
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So they're intentionally choosing, they are deliberately and intentionally choosing to be vicious people. They're just mistaken, thinking that's going to make them happy, when really it's going to make them miserable. That's what he's saying. Good so far?
Yeah.
It's still their fault. They still intentionally chose vicious actions. Even though people with a bad character may be ignorant and even seem unable to choose right things, so now we got the extreme scenario. So even though people with a bad character may be ignorant or even seem unable to choose the right things, this condition stems from decisions that were originally voluntary. No one accidentally becomes addicted to cigarettes. You might end up addicted to cigarettes, but that first choice was 100% voluntary.
Yeah.
And now it might not be a choice anymore, in one perspective. No child is born with a bad character or a good character, and it is only through deliberate choices, or at least for the most part through deliberate choices, that these are developed. So you deliberately choose the type of life you end up leading, relative to how happy or miserable it is. And he makes an example relating to someone's physical health. For example, relating to physical health, while no one blames those who are ill-formed by nature, you don't blame someone who's paralyzed that they can't run. You would censure those who couldn't run through lack of exercise or neglect. Because when they were youths, they could do that. And they have deliberately chosen a style of life that eventually made so that this was no longer a possibility for them. Right? So if you saw 20-year-olds who couldn't run a mile anymore, that's because of a bunch of deliberate choices that they made, assuming that they weren't ill-formed by nature in some way. So it's kind of like that. No child is born evil, no child is born good, and then you make the deliberate choices that you make, which have the greatest effect on how you turn out. Maybe we can finish. I think we can finish. We'll go a little bit faster now. Okay, intellectual virtues, not as important. They're a lot more straightforward. They're important for ethics, but they don't need much explanation. So the intellectual virtues Aristotle identifies are art or technique or skill. Scientific knowledge, this is demonstrated knowledge. This is a type of knowledge you develop when you go through a geometry course. Practical wisdom, this is getting good at deliberation. This is pretty much what we were talking about this whole time. Getting good at making virtuous decisions, practical wisdom.
And you can only get that through experience, right? That's what he's saying.
Yes, this one comes through experience. Intuitive reason, that's grasping things like the law of contradiction. The statement is either true or it's not true. It can't be both. The statement is never both true and not true. There's no proof of that. That's just your intuitive reason grasping that. And then finally there's philosophic wisdom. Philosophic wisdom for him is a combination of intuitive reason with scientific knowledge. When you apply demonstration to those first principles, you get what he calls philosophic wisdom.
Okay.
So the most crucial of these are philosophic wisdom, which encompasses intuition and scientific knowledge, and then practical wisdom. So these are the two most crucial of them, and then the specific skills or arts you pick up, those help you live a better life too, but they're not near as important. So while moral virtues are a mean, with intellectual virtues, more is always better. So these do not lie on a mean. More is always better. It's always better to have more knowledge than less knowledge. Always, there's no limit.
Oh, and that's really how he classifies the two different types of virtues.
No, he classifies them differently. Parts relating to the rational part of your soul, the other parts are relating to the appetitive part of your soul. So these all have to do with the rational part of your soul. He says the ones that have to do with the rational part of your soul, it's a simple fact that more is always better. There's no such thing as too much.
Okay.
Okay, so the chief of the intellectual virtues is philosophical wisdom. While practical wisdom seems to be the most crucial in developing moral virtues, it is also dependent upon philosophical wisdom in the same way that health is dependent upon medicine or medical knowledge. So you need some knowledge, either directly in yourself or maybe the person guiding you, of what the good and the bad is to help you start developing practical wisdom. through good choices. So he says they're both cheap, they're both good, but he puts philosophical wisdom above practical wisdom for that reason. Okay, quick outline of justice here because we're not going to go into it very much. And this was justice just relative to the state. Aristotle says there's two types of justices. There's general justice and practical justice. General justice, what do we mean by that? We mean that the justice is what's lawful. And he calls these things accidentally just. There's the other ones he calls naturally just. So accidentally just things, there's nothing naturally unjust about you moving 40 miles per hour. Now if you're moving 40 miles per hour on a street that the law says the speed limit is 25 miles per hour, now you're unjust. So in that case, it's accidentally unjust. It's not by nature that you shouldn't move 40 miles per hour. It's in this very particular case that you shouldn't move 40 miles per hour. It just happens to be because of the laws that you're a part of. If the state got rid of that law, that would no longer be an unjust act. So completely dependent on the laws. Okay, now natural justice seems to be targeted more at equality or fairness in some way. Natural justice. And he splits us into two types. There's distributive justice and corrective justice. Distributive justice is giving equals to equals and unequals to unequals. Quick example of that. Imagine that you and I both work for a company. You're the CEO of the company. I'm a secretary for the company. And now imagine that we got paid the same amount. Okay. That's unjust. That's giving equals to unequals. You and I are unequal. You're the CEO. I'm, can't remember what I said. Lowly employee. And yet we're treating unequals like equals. So he says this justice is equals to equals and unequals to unequals. Don't treat unequals like they're equals. Okay? Give them what's due. That's in distributive justice. Corrective justice now is correcting some injustice, some imbalance. So in corrective justice, we subtract from one to compensate the other. Subtract from one to compensate the other. And he breaks this down into two types of transactions: voluntary transactions and involuntary transactions. Voluntary transactions: buying, selling, lending, investing, depositing. So let's look at buying. In buying, I take from you a table. Okay, now I need to correct that by giving you some money. So that's corrective justice for me to give you the money for the table.
I see.
Okay, that's buying. Selling, very similar. Lending, very similar. I lend it to you. The corrective part is you give it back to me at some point, etc. I think you get that one. Okay, involuntary transactions. There's the furtive ones, the ones you try and do kind of behind the scenes without being noticed. And then the ones by force are the more direct ones, where you're right there in your seat. So, for the ones where you try not to be detective, there's things like theft, adultery, assassination, bearing false witness. So theft, you try not to get caught, obviously. Commit adultery with someone, you try not to get caught, obviously. Assassination, you're trying not to get caught, obviously. And then false witness, that's not you telling someone off to their face. That's me spreading rumors about Peter behind Peter's back that take away from his reputation. So robbing you of your reputation, robbing you of your life, robbing you of your wife, robbing you of your possessions. Taking from you in some way. And it's up to the law to decide how those ought to be restored or dealt with. And then force is where I just directly do it. I assault you, I murder you, or I flat out seize your stuff, I just take it. Or rape, or verbal abuse as opposed to false witness. I take away your reputation right to your face. That's his quick outline of justice.
Okay.
He has a lot to say about justice. It's 1/10 the book. But we gotta be quick. Okay. A content person. Now we're doing content versus uncontent people. Content people, well, a content person makes a rational calculation as to what ought to be done and follows through. An incontent person makes the same calculation, but fails to follow through, being led by base appetite or the appetitive soul. So a continent person is someone who has the will to follow through with what they conclude they ought to do. An incontinent person doesn't have that willpower. So for Aristotle, there's a difference between virtues and then just being continent or incontinent.
Okay.
So a continent person can be virtuous, but a continent person can also be unvirtuous. I can choose the vicious action and stand by it because I'm a continent person. I can choose the virtuous action and stand by it because I'm a continent person. And then the incontinent person comes to the conclusion about what they ought to do and then holds off anyways. Right? You have the decision, I should get up and get started on my homework right now, but I'm still going to lay in bed. And you know that's a bad choice and you chose to do it anyways. That's the incontinent person. Because at least you recognize what the right choice was. You didn't decide, I should choose to do something vicious. You decided, I should do this virtuous act, but I just don't have it in me. So in that case, he's calling you incontinent. Okay, so I'll read this one more time now. We went over that, I think you'll get it. A continent person makes a rational calculation as to what ought to be done and follows through. An incontinent person makes the same calculation, but fails to follow through, being led by base appetites. It was more pleasurable to just stay in bed. So, Aristotle lists three conditions of character to avoid. 1, vice, obviously. You don't want to be a vicious person. That's worse. Don't be an incontinent person. You're not technically a vicious person here. You're just an incontinent person. So, a vicious person, they're stable in their disposition. They've deliberately chosen. They did exactly what they wanted to, and that was to be vicious. An incontinent person, they know what ought to be done, but being weak-willed chose the wrong thing. And then finally, bestiality. This type of person, they don't even consider what ought to be done. They just respond to whatever is right there in front of them. They don't give any consideration to anything. They're just very impulsive, just reacting to life as it goes by. They're like an animal. They're like a beast. So, while Socrates was of the opinion that no one knowingly does wrong, Aristotle disagrees and claims it's via their incontinence that people can knowingly do wrong. Incontinent people do it all the time. Socrates always thought the only reason someone does wrong is because they didn't know any better. Socrates says, no, they can, or I might have said that backwards. Socrates says the only reason they do wrong is because they didn't know any better. Aristotle says, no, they can come to the right conclusion and still choose to do wrong. That's an incontinent person. Continence versus temperance. So you might think, isn't not giving away to your base appetites, isn't that just what temperance is? What's the difference between continence and temperance? So continent people don't act on base appetites. Temperate people no longer have base appetites. When you take pleasure in the things you should take pleasures in, and pains in the things that you should take pains in, you no longer have those base appetites. You work them out of you. I don't know if you've ever, one of the things I noticed is like I used to drink Shasta as a kid. And I stopped drinking Shasta. I go and try to drink it now. It's awful to me now. It's way too strong. As a kid I enjoyed it, and now it's gross to me. I no longer take pleasure in that thing I used to take pleasure in. That's the difference between temperance and being continent. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's worse, incontinence or vice? Obviously, vice. Incontinent people, they recognize that they're doing something wrong, and so there's a chance that they'll decide differently and actually act upon their right conclusions later. They'll feel remorse, they'll feel regret. Vicious people, they intentionally do wrong. They know what they're doing, they deliberately chose it. A vicious person does not regret their actions, and so will not change. Incontinent person, you often regret not getting up and doing your homework when you're incontinent. An incontinent person is like a city that passes good laws, but fails to uphold or enforce them. A vicious person, on the other hand, is like a city that intentionally passes bad laws, and then strictly upholds and enforces them. Very different. So while pleasure is not inherently a good, there are such things as base pleasures or bad pleasures. The good life is a pleasant one. It is natural to want to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain, and therefore cannot be wrong. It is built into your human nature that you want pleasure and you don't want pain. So you cannot be praised or blamed for wanting pleasure and wanting to avoid pain. That's part of your human nature. So we can't call that a good or a bad. So it's natural to want to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and therefore it cannot be wrong. The virtuous person learns to take pleasure in the right things. And so they still have a life of pleasure. Make sense?
Yeah.
So they're still living a life of pleasure and avoiding a life of pain. They just train themselves to take pleasure in the right things and pains in the right things. Because the fact that they're going to take pleasures and pains in things is just a fact of human nature. Friendship now. Now, while friendship is not a virtue, it is an external good. So there's nothing virtuous about having a friend. It's just an external good. But it's one that Aristotle thought was pretty necessary, pretty common for the Greeks. He gives like 2 chapters, like 1/5 of the book is on friendship. We're just barely going to scratch it. There's 3 types of friendships. Friendships based on utility. You're friends with people because they provide some good or service for you. There's friendships based on pleasures. You're friends with people because you like hanging out with them. It brings you some sort of pleasure. And then there's the right types of pleasure, or right types of friendships. Friendships based on the good. So in these 2 friendships, it's because you want something from the other person. Aristotle says in these types of friendships, you're completely selfless, and you want nothing from that person who's your friend. And he says it's like a mother's love for their child. The mother wants nothing in return from that child. But these types of friendships develop between two moral people who have like this mutual respect for each other's virtues. And so they'll have a selfless type of friendship. So a friendship based upon the good are the perfect form of friendships where both friends enjoy each other's virtues. So as long as both friends keep similarly virtuous characters, the relationship will endure and be both pleasant and useful and good for both parties. So this type of friendship encompasses both these. It has the benefits of both these plus more. Make sense?
Yeah.
And so that's what he advocates. And he says it's possible for good people to still have incomplete friendships with lesser people. So they could have this type of friendship or this type of friendship with lesser people. But this type of friendship can only exist against two morally equal people. Okay, so that was friendship, finally our conclusion now. So what is happiness? It is something final and self-sufficient and is the ultimate end of human action. While it is necessary to have a limited amount of external goods, it is necessary to develop the moral virtues, happiness can be best achieved by the contemplative life, is what Aristotle comes to the conclusion of. The intellectual virtues are limitless good, where more is always better. And so the contemplative life has the most potential for happiness. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So as you get the external goods, you develop your character, and now once that's said and done, you develop the intellectual virtues as much as you can, which is what you do in the contemplative life. So that's the type of life he advocates the most for. Finally, note the prime mover, a connection he makes here. Finally, note the prime mover. Remember what the prime mover is? It's thought thinking about thought. Right? Prime mover, it's pure form. It's just thought thinking about thought, that thing that exists outside the universe and causes all motion in the universe, the unmoved mover, the prime mover, the God, Aristotle's God. Finally, note the prime mover, thought thinking about thought, and consider then that there is no more godly action a mortal can take than contemplation. Thought. That's all the prime mover does. So it's the most godly thing you can do. Now, at the very end, Aristotle reminds us one more time that study alone does not make a man virtuous, though. And so not only read, but also act upon the provided knowledge. It says, it's not enough that you just read this work and got through this work. You need to now go and act upon this work, otherwise you're never going to become a virtuous person. So while the contemplative life, yeah, that's all great, you still got to develop your character. And that's not done through contemplation. So get out there and start being virtuous. And that's how he ends up. Okay, so we'll call it there. Glad we were